This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week I'm speaking to founder of Wildflower Turf Limited and author of the book How to Make a Wildflower Meadow, James Hewetson-Brown. James has a vast amount of experience creating meadows at domestic and public scales. He's passionate about creating species-rich habitats which are attractive to people and wildlife, and which have the added benefits of pollution mitigation and carbon sequestration. We talk about the nuts and bolts of meadow making, but also about why meadows can be the solution to so many of our landscaping needs.
Essentially, I'm a farmer and I went to agricultural college and learnt about all things farming. And I'm lucky enough to be the son of a farmer. My father was first generation farming and we have an arable farm in Hampshire. And all of this has come about. So all of our interests, my interests, because he was an out and out farmer and I suggested wildflowers to him and he kind of looked at me a bit suspiciously. But really the interest that has come about is my desire to kind of move a little bit away from straight farming, and that's partly driven by commercial requirements, and look at wildflowers in a way that can work for everybody, but mainly through practical experience and a sort of farmer's practical take on how to make it work. And I think that's quite important for me. Everything we do has to be with this idea of it being easy to achieve and practical to achieve. So my professional background in terms of farming has helped us to get this going.
And your book is about establishing meadows. And I think that you may be of the opinion that they're a quick solution to bring biodiversity back to previously barren areas. And I wondered if you could A, say whether that is the case, and B, if that's applicable in both a larger scale and also in urban environments. Can it be useful in both?
Well, absolutely, to both of those. And the thing is that wildflowers are really, in a way, the true definition of biodiversity, because really biodiversity is just a number of species in a given area. And that's right across from the species and mycorrhiza that are in the soil and little bugs in the soil. Then the wildflower bit is the vegetative species, and then that carries through to wildlife. And so the more of everything is the better the biodiversity you have. But you need certain things to be able to drive that total number. And you need soil, and you need a healthy soil, but then you need a great variety of plant life. And that's where the biodiversity really kicks in, because if you have that variety of plant life, then you can expect to see the variety of insects and bees and butterflies, and that carries through to the higher food chain. It's in voles through to slow worms through to the predators that prey on them. So wildflowers really do tick the biodiversity box to answer the sort of first part of your question. And then the second bit in terms of how quickly you can get it to work. That has proven to be difficult with wildflowers, and it is quite tricky from seed. That does take a bit of time, and there are various techniques which I do go through in the book as to how to get wildflowers to work from seed. And quite a lot of people have put a lot of effort into how this should be done, from regular mowing for 3 to 4 years to also what type of plants you're using to achieve your meadow and how competitive they are. And if you really go into the detail, when you're talking about seed, and I, as a farmer, know that if we use farm seed, it goes through very heavy regulation and certification, quality checks. But with wildflowers, there is none of that. So some of the wildflower seed historically has been of dubious quality. And we found that because we've been buying a lot over the years, and we sometimes find very, very poor germination or even very poor content of actual seed in the quantity of material that we've bought. So seeding wildflowers has been fraught with difficulties, and we're just learning much more, and that is getting better. But I suppose what I talk about in the book is the other and more modern techniques to make this work. And essentially that is, we've developed this wildflower turf, and we have some other products that just are about trying to get this to work quickly. Because that is so important. You want it to work quickly for lots of practical reasons, like competitive plants. To be competitive and really thrive, they need to establish quickly, but also through to who wants those flowers in terms of bees and bugs and butterflies. You need it to be working quickly to really improve biodiversity and really bring the benefits that wildflowers can give, like carbon sequestration and things we'll perhaps come to. But there are two things. One is making it work well, and the other is making it work quickly, and both work together and go hand in hand.
Obviously, there's different ways of doing it. You can either do it from seed, or you can look to convert maybe an area of turf so that it contains more wildflowers, which I guess would be a longer term project. Or you can do what your company, I suppose, specialises in, which is lay the wildflower turf. I'm guessing each of those has its advantages and disadvantages. Does it depend on the conditions you're starting with?
A lot depends on the conditions that you find yourself in, and they're always going to be variable, and they can be a sort of permanent condition like the type of soil you've got, but it can also be a temporary condition of when you start the process, what time of year it is, how much rain you've had, the temperature, and also there's an influence of what outside pressures might affect it. So that could be pests and diseases, really. That, along with the weather and things, probably covers most of the influences. So yes, there are pros and cons to each. And actually, the great thing with wildflowers is you can achieve it fairly successfully just from doing nothing. I mean, you've mentioned the lawn, and sort of theoretically, you could just let your lawn grow and you just leave it. And after a while, and I'm talking years here, like 5 to 10 years, you could expect to see a greater increase in wildflowers within that area. Well, again, my father would have called it arable weeds, or weeds are getting into your lawn. So you can go from the top quality lawn to pretty much a wildflower area, but that will take a long time. And all you need to do to that is cut it once a year, let it grow long. That's called natural regeneration, and that takes time. The other sort of difficulty with that is that grasses are very competitive and wildflowers aren't all that competitive. And therefore, the grasses tend to dominate for a long time. That's why it takes so long. And why would the grasses even disappear? And the harder you treat them, the sort of less happy they are. But in our temperate climate in the UK, grasses grow at quite a low temperature. So grasses grow at about 2 degrees centigrade. So through the winter, they carry on growing. And that means they remain competitive. And the wildflowers stop growing at a higher temperature of sort of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade. So the grasses have many advantages to dominate. So leaving your lawn to grow long is going to take a long time, and the results are going to be limited. And you're relying on seeds coming in from somewhere in order to develop the wildflowers. We got quite involved with the Olympics, 2012 Olympics. And one of the things that when I spoke to an ecologist there, he talked a lot about source material. He was after wildflowers, but where are they going to come from? They don't just suddenly appear. So by introducing them as seed, that is what is going to give you wildflowers. And that's when you start thinking about the other ways of doing it. So natural regen is probably the easiest, and this is sort of mentioned in the book. And then you can go right through to the other end of that establishment scale and go for some wildflower turf, which is effectively you have an instant meadow. The second you lay that, you have the plants that you want, the wildflowers you want, at the ratio that you want them, and they're immediately competitive. But yes, you're right. So you've got the natural generation, which takes a long time on one end of the scale, and you've got wildflower turf on the other. But there is also a cost implication with that. Natural generation is going to cost you nothing. And the wildflower turf is probably the most expensive or the highest cost way to establish a wildflower meadow. But within that, you have to balance the amount of work to get it and the time it's going to take.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well what you said about the different mixture of species that you would have in a meadow. And talking about the grasses, is it necessary to have grass species in a meadow, or is it in fact not at all desirable?
Well, that's a very good question, and it really depends on what you're really trying to achieve. So environmentally, and if you're speaking to an ecologist, they would want grasses, because on every species of grass, there will be an insect or a butterfly or a bee that uses it either for pollination or just for vegetation, or even voles or animals, full stop, will rely on grasses. So it's always good to have some grasses, but it is about the ratio you put them in. And it is also about what you want to achieve. So the ecologist is one thing, and if you're just looking for out and out colour and nothing else, then you probably don't want too many grasses. But that opens up another whole set of questions on, yes, that mix that you put in the first place, and on the larger scale, is that going to be UK native or non-native, and is it going to be perennial or annual plants that you're using? Those are the 4 categories that you think about. And then grass is in their own category, really. Whatever grass you put in, you can have it in there for good reason, but you definitely want to have a very, very low rate. And what you're trying to achieve, you might want to cut it entirely.
And thinking about the annual perennial species, would you plump for one or the other, or is it good to have a mixture of both?
The thing with annuals is you can rely on them. They're pretty reliable if you sow them, and they're also generally very colourful. And there are quite a few non-native annuals that really add a lot of colour. But even if you look at our native wildflowers, like the poppy, it's a bling, really. You can get real bling with annual flowers. The thing about annuals is they are what they say they are, which is an annual event. So poppies, it's not to say in the second year you won't see them at all, but unless you're managing for annuals, you tend to see them die out quite quickly because the perennials take over. So if you think about the classic thing with poppies, they were an emblem for the First World War when there was all this disturbance of soil on the battlefields, and the resultant poppies, they were basically shown the light of day, given the perfect conditions, which was a lot of bare soil, and the poppies came through. But if you go and look at those places now, the poppies aren't there. They're still in the soil, the seeds are in the soil, but they need this particular management, which is essentially tilling the soil every year. And if you do that, you can expect annuals every year. And that's the bottom line of it. If you want annuals, you have to be prepared to create a seedbed every year. Either sow them or rely on the seed that's come from the previous year, and both do sort of work. Generally, if you've gone to the trouble of tilling the soil, people re-sow annuals, and that gives you your most reliable results for annuals. But there's quite a lot of work with that, and every time you till the soil, you do create a habitat for weed seeds, and this is what we found using annuals, that after a while, things like fat hen and thistles really can proliferate in that soils because you create the perfect circumstances for them as well. So that can be a problem. And then again, in a bigger picture thing, that constant tilling of the soil, well, there's a good argument for not doing that through carbon release. And that's where perennials work so well, because you're not having to till every year. So you do sequester more carbon with that system.
And I guess it's horses for courses, but if you were specifying a meadow, I guess it depends on whether you're doing it for aesthetic reasons or whether you're doing it for biodiversity reasons. But would you say in some circumstances native wildflower meadows would be better than non-native, or does it depend?
Again, this is our experience. I would say that native are definitely better if you're in sort of rural locations and sort of more agricultural type of locations, or even verges on roads and that sort of thing. I definitely think there's a place for non-native in gardens, without doubt, because they're there anyway, and you can create interesting and diverse wildflower meadows using non-natives in that type of habitat. So that's my sort of rule and thumb. Stick with the urban for the non-natives and stick with the rural for the natives. But there is also, our experience has shown that it's quite hard to retain perennial non-natives. So where we've done this, generally, the perennial non-natives will show for 2 or 3 years, and some species are better than others. But what we found is the UK native stuff tends to take over after a few years. That's definitely the case with annuals, as I've already said. But we, at the moment, we want to find this because we do think that they have a part to play in the sort of more urban areas, as I say, and we would love to make a sort of non-native turf and our other products to add to the colour. But the jury's out, in my opinion, a little bit. It does work. We've got some quite good colourful mixes using near-native wildflowers, and we're working on that hard, actually. So, yeah, both have a very powerful part to play. And actually, it's been proven by the RHS that the non-natives can do a great job for insects and pollinators as well. So they will tick that box. I think the ecologists, the real purists, are thinking, why are we putting non-native plants out and sort of diluting the gene pool of what's a really useful habitat and we want to look after that. It's tried and tested and it's got longevity, so we need to look after that. And that's where they start to get very concerned with non-natives going into just widespread and generally everywhere.
As you said, the issue is obviously the non-natives can provide nectar and pollen, but they're not really any good as kind of host species for larval stages. So I think you can probably tell I would come down on that camp. But the other thing that I always think about these meadows, as you say, the jury is certainly out, I think, from what I've heard anecdotally from people who are charged with looking after some of these spaces. It's difficult to know how they'll develop because it is a bit of an untested sphere, but also with the non-native meadows, it's tricky because they set an expectation that that is what a meadow should look like to the general public. And obviously that isn't what a traditional meadow would look like. So do we need to be careful with that as well?
You just hit the nail on the head, actually. What we try and do is explain all of what you've summed up, really. And it's so important to manage people's expectations. And you're so right that a lot of these annual meadows or annual areas, really, they're not even really meadows because they're sort of transitory, really. The annuals, and to an extent the non-natives, they are exactly that, setting standards that are quite hard to achieve. And in order to achieve them, they do take a lot of looking after and maintenance. And also, I think what you've also said there that's critical is that UK native wildflowers are absolutely lovely. And I don't think anyone denies that. They're very subtle in their colour. They're not the bling. But we've got some areas here that are just absolutely wonderful. They're just colourful and beautiful and subtle. And having access to them is fantastic. If you immerse yourself in them, you find so much life that's going on. But they are not very long lasting. I mean, the ultimate of the bling thing is you've got bling 12 months of the year. And I think pretty much any person who knows anything about plants knows that that isn't going to happen. In our sort of winter climate, you might on the equator, but around here, you're not going to get 12 months of the year colour. So then it's just a case of working on that scale back to probably the shortest are the native, in terms of flowering, are the native wildflowers, but they're also the easiest to look after. They're also probably the best for biodiversity, and you've just mentioned that, and wildlife. And they're also just a habitat that you can, I think, people need to look at and not expect bling. They just need to take it for what it is and see that colour at the time and almost treat it for the rarity value that they are now anyway, because they're so small areas. But just to see one is a privilege, in fact, and to be able to study it over the time it's flowering and to enjoy it in that time is a privilege. So it's managing that expectation and accepting that if you go for this, it isn't all about colour. It is about what you're doing in the big picture, which is sequestering carbon. It is providing habitat for wildlife. It is giving you colour and health and well-being options, because just sitting down in a meadow is lovely at the right time of year. But you're not going to do that in the middle of winter. So wait for the right time and really appreciate it at the time. And setting expectations by calling things without wanting to run it down, because I don't. I think it's wonderful, but the Windsor Sea of Flowers that they've just done is great. And it's the same with the Olympics. A lot of the Olympic Park flowers were annuals, and they were set up. It took 2 or 3 years to make it work. And they used clean soil there, so there was no weed ingress. And it was relatively short term. It was very, very good for the Olympics. If you went back the following year, it was all right. If you go back now, it's reverted to native wildflowers. So it's still fantastic, but the colour is much more subtle colour. My point is that you can get this fantastic colour, but it is much more of a garden thing. So it's much more of a, I've got to work for this. I've got to control nature to achieve this. Whereas if you go for the native wildflowers, you can just let it do its thing and accept that it is doing its thing for so many reasons. It's just not necessarily ticking that full-on colour box so well. So it's a bit of a rant on that, because it is so important to understand this, because people must go in wanting wildflowers for the right reason. And that even that label, the wildflowers thing, which you also said is important, because really the only true wildflowers are UK native wildflowers and some UK native annuals.
Yes, and it's fine if there is a place for all of these things, but it's important, I think, to maybe not mislabel them and missell them.
You're so right. And gardens are absolutely fine. People have the gardens to do that and do what they want to make it colourful. And I totally agree and understand with that. But the opportunity with wildflowers is probably really outside the gardening arena. And I know this is about gardening, but look in the bigger picture and look at all the verges and look at agricultural land and look at the semi-urban land that isn't gardens, roundabouts and parks and things like that, and grab those opportunities to develop the wildflowers in those areas. And there's huge areas that could be used to put in wildflowers that do benefit biodiversity and all the other things. Carbon is a big one, but pollution, wildflowers have a real ability because they're so sort of hardy. They're not particularly competitive, but they're incredibly hardy. So they will put up with dirty water runoff and air pollution really well. And they're so good at dealing with pests and diseases as well. So they have really multifunctional talents. And in my opinion, they're not getting used well enough in the bigger area. The gardeners are great and they've embraced it and it's had a lot of coverage at the shows, Chelsea and things. But it's these bigger areas where we don't want to do so much maintenance and we don't want to use so much fuel to mow that there's a real opportunity. So that's the big picture stuff.
Yeah, it's important to say, I think. So going back to your book, you have got some amazing projects in there with a variety of different types of meadow, and they all look lovely. So I think my last question is, maybe you could just tell me about one project that's really interesting that you've worked on or that you're maybe particularly proud of.
I've sort of already mentioned it. There are a few. It has to be the Olympics, I'm afraid, and I'll say why, and I've already mentioned it. But it was in the early days of our sort of business. We knew that the wildflower system that we'd developed was a really good one to establish wildflowers. We were still early in the recognition of wildflowers full stop across the board. We were very lucky that the whole business started with the interest from people developing with nature and wildlife and wildflowers and habitat. But when it was 2012 and that Olympics came across our bow and we had the opportunity to contribute to it, it really did elevate that because there were so many people looking at the opening ceremony and all the green and pleasant land came from this farm, pretty much all of it, all the colourful bits, all the grassy bits where the sheep were. So that was like a huge audience looking in at what we were trying to promote, which was sustainability and the whole green agenda, really. And then outside that opening ceremony, we did a lot for the Athletes Village, and that's still there. So it's nice to be able to go and see that still. And with all of that came this recognition, first of all, of us and our products, but also it really drove the interest in wildflowers. So that was a really big project, and it was really difficult to achieve because we were a much smaller business then. So we had the last lorry sat on our tarmac of the day of the opening ceremony, and it was really down to the wire. And so to sit back and watch that in the evening was a fairly defining moment, I think, for us and our business and just for what we've managed to achieve. So that's probably the one. There have been many other really interesting projects in the gardening realm as well. Chelsea, we've done some really big show gardens and things. And when I say we've done it, we just supply the wildflowers and we sort of grow them on. So there are lots of others, but that's probably the biggest and most memorable one.
Thank you, James, for the chat about Meadows, but also for being a passionate advocate for the whole concept behind Meadows and how they can create landscaping solutions that benefit everyone and everything. And thanks to you, as always, for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about bugs that will see all of us out.
We only have to look around our gardens to realise that there's a vast and diverse array of creatures that live alongside us, and that their basic requirements for survival are usually very similar to ours. However, during recent years, organisms have been discovered that were very different because they were surviving in environments that would be lethal for all other known life forms on Earth. Discovering these organisms was not only surprising, but of great interest and value to modern-day science. From heat and pressure-resistant bacteria discovered in hot volcanic vents deep under the oceans, to rock algae growing in the coldest regions of Antarctica, these organisms thrived. And so, not surprisingly, they were called extremophiles. And quite incredibly, one of these extremophiles is a tiny group of invertebrates, closely related to insects, that are called the tardigrades. Tardigrades are less than 1 millimetre in length, sausage-shaped, and have 4 pairs of stumpy clawed legs and a large round mouth that they use to vacuum up microscopic prey into their almost transparent bodies. And now that we know about tardigrades, the more we look, the more species are found from virtually anywhere around the world, with over 1,000 having been recorded so far, from hot springs in America to the top of the Himalayas, and from the sediment at the bottom of the deepest oceans to within layers of polar ice. And also in ponds, meadows, and even in our gardens here in Britain, where they can be found living within moss and algae. But what makes tardigrades an extremophile is their ability to survive extreme conditions by using a biological process that hasn't been seen before in any other organism. They're able to change the water in their bodies into a sugar that preserves them during periods of extreme cold and drought. And the effectiveness of this process was demonstrated by tardigrades that were found to have survived for over 100 years amongst museum material. And more recently by tardigrades that survived a 12-day experiment within the cold vacuum of outer space. In fact, continued research into the lives of these tiny creatures has discovered that some species can withstand temperatures down to minus 272 Celsius and up to 150 degrees Celsius, while others survived atmospheric pressures 6 times greater than those found in the deepest oceanic trenches, and others were unaffected by radiation levels hundreds of times higher than the lethal dose for humans. And so, consequently, it's been suggested that tardigrades are likely to live through a complete global mass extinction event, and would therefore supersede the cockroach's reputation as the ultimate survivor by a very wide margin.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.